a report showing, looking at 124 individuals who've been convicted of Islamism-related offences since 1999 to 2009. And what we have shown is that the threat is actually quite targeted, in the sense that the majority of individuals who were convicted were young men, mostly came from London, mainly came from the South Asian community, and often had links to Pakistan. So when you're looking at countering the terrorism threat, it's important to target your strategies to those areas, as opposed to, for example, giving money to all community organizations or any community organizations, hoping that they'll combat radicalization or extremism within Muslim communities in the UK.
Well, you mentioned there the paper that the Centre for Social Cohesion has produced, and if I could just quote some of the other facts that you present in that particular paper, and that is details such as the fact that 31% of those studies actually had a higher education, 31% attended training camps abroad, 32% had links to prescribed organizations. Now, what I'd like to ask you, Tobias Feakin, is why is it left to a private organization to produce statistics such as this, which would appear on the face of it to be invaluable in terms of countering any potential threat?
That's probably best to ask the government that question, and I certainly don't represent them. I would suggest that in terms of, think tanks like my own and also the Centre for Social Cohesion, that's our job, to assess evidence that we can find to try and enlighten government policy in any way that we can. And if the government were conducting a study like that themselves, it would immediately be invalid in many respects and could be perceived as such from the public. But the fact that an independent body has come out and, conducted this research, a valuable piece of research, is highly significant in itself.
Azzam, Tamimi, I'd like to pick up on the point that was made just a little bit earlier about part of the government's measures, or a very large part of them, have been targeting a specific section of the British society, and that is the Muslim community. What is your views on the fact that a sector of the society is singled out rather than the behavior of the society as a whole?
Well, because the atrocities were committed by Muslim individuals, and because in their justification of their acts they relied on Islam and quoted verses from the Quran, and because they referred to Islamic causes, the general impression is that this is a Muslim problem. Although in reality, and if the government wants to deal with this problem correctly, it should be seen as a political problem rather than a religious problem. And targeting or giving the impression that the Muslim community is being targeted may appease certain segments of society, like the extreme right or like the Zionist lobby in this country, but it will definitely spoil relations between the Muslims and the government on the one hand, and between or among the various components of British society, that is the Muslims and the non-Muslims.
Well, certainly one remembers historically that in the IRA bombing campaigns of the 80s and the 90s, certainly this type of program was not followed. No singling out of an Irish community, for example, for special attention. Tobias Feakin, why do you think there is a specified direction of the government attempts over the past 5 years to prevent further such attacks?
I think if you'll actually look at some of the documentation that the government provide us now in terms of their prevent program, actually, they're quite careful to define that they don't specifically target the Muslim population of the UK. Within violent extremism, they include far-right groups, extremist animal rights groups who are willing to use violence in that sense. So I think it's a lesson that's being learnt from government's perspective that, certainly in terms of the language that they use in both in public and also kind of documentation that they use, they need to make sure that they're not seen to be targeting one particular part of society. I mean, let's not forget, this is about Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism that really, a lot of the kind of push from government came to counter that particular threat, and that is an ideological Al-Qaeda is an ideology as far as I'm concerned, and really what government's concerned with is countering that ideology and that threat, if you like. They're not, as far as I'm concerned, particularly targeting the entire Muslim population. It's about countering the Al-Qaeda ideological threat. And in terms of what they've been doing around the PREVENT program, I think there's a lot of good work that's gone on there. Conversely, some not so good work, which actually has included people who perhaps shouldn't be representing communities because they clearly don't. But again, lessons have to be learnt from that experience. The PREVENT program, I think, could do with an overhaul in terms of how it's presented, how it's conceived, and also how it's delivered, and how the messages from the centre about what PREVENT really stands for, how those messages are actually put out to both those people who have to implement the programs and also those who are affected by them.
Well, Houriya Ahmed, critics of that PREVENT program that we've heard mention of there contend that it is a program aimed at ideas rather than against actions. What's your view?
I think the PREVENT agenda has a lot of positives and negatives. Yes, it is a program aimed at ideas, which makes it even more difficult to try and counter those ideas if you don't really know how to define those ideas in the first place. I mean, excuse me, but Tobias said that the government's agenda talks about violent extremism in general. I think the government is trying to be too politically correct by not actually defining the threat, where it comes from, or what the threat actually is. Yes, we have a problem with white supremacism, we have a problem with animal rights extremism, but we also have a problem with Islamist terrorism. So let's define it. Let's talk about this problem. And I think that's the problem. The problem is that a lot of Muslim communities in the UK feel that they are targeted by the government, whether rationally or irrationally so, and the government really needs to decide how they want to give money to organizations. At the moment, they're just giving money to any organizations. They're funding sports activities and or think tanks claiming to counter radicalization, but we actually haven't seen the results of how the money being spent, which is over £100 million a year, is actually countering radicalization. What are the positive effects of it? We can't really see that, because every year so far, even today, the government talks about trying to thwart cells that are planning attacks in the UK.
Well, let's just pause here. And government officials said a number of families requested that there be no formal event marking the anniversary, but there have been complaints from others at the lack of an official commemoration. Yet during the weekly question time in Parliament, Prime Minister David Cameron marked the day in a brief statement.